Emotions Matter, brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com, your solution for emotional intelligence. We're fortunate to have Jeffrey Beck with us on this episode of the Emotions Matter podcast as we explore research, science, and technology. Jeffrey brings with him a background in engineering and engineering research. His master's in mechanical engineering focused on a specialization in controls and automation. Following a life change in his personal consciousness, Jeffrey now focuses his efforts on system dynamics and adaptive control, and its relationship to psychology and human consciousness. Welcome, Jeffrey, or do you prefer Jeff? It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, Jeff's fine. Thanks, John. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk to you and your audience today about work I've been doing to try and understand myself and other humans.
Well, terrific. Give our listeners some background regarding the significant, let's call it a pivot, you took in your life, which took you from engineering for coal mining to human psychology mining, let's say.
Yeah, that's actually sort of come in a couple different shifts over my life. When I did my master's degree in system dynamics and controls, I was really working through trying to understand myself better at the time. I hadn't ever got into any serious relationships up to that point, and I was around 30, so that was pretty late in life by normal standards. Anyway, I used what I was learning as an engineer and how feedback systems work, feed-forward systems work, to try and understand myself better. And I did some experimenting just with breathing techniques to work on shifting my own consciousness back and forth between left and right hemispheres to try and understand my own drive systems. And I found that for me, that it actually worked pretty well. It was some tricks from Kundalini Yoga I found out later. Anyway, that was something I did at that point in time. And then, I was really trying to evaluate my life at that point. I'd worked for most of 10 years as an research engineer for a large mining and oil company, and reevaluated my life position at that point and decided, I really got a bunch of patents, proved myself, and I found it just didn't mean that much to me anymore compared with just living life. I didn't want to live where they told me to live, and so at that point I decided to go back to the family farm and run that. Wanted to raise my family in that kind of environment rather than in a mining town, and the shift there was I'd been using the breathing techniques to learn how to feel centered in my own head, basically. And shortly after I returned home, I got involved with somebody who'd been back where I'd gone to school, and we got married, and she was already admitted to med school, so they ended up being Mr. Mom during med school residency, helped her set up a solo practice in the rural community where I live in Utah. And just went about the business of raising a family, running the family farm, helping her do her clinic, manage her clinic. And along the way, I got into the medical side of understanding psychology. DSM-3, I think, was what was out at that point in time. And trying to understand just patterns in my own family and in her family and how we could raise kids that turned out maybe healthier than their parents. So I was pretty interested in that. And then again, as time went on, that relationship didn't thrive, I guess is the word for it. Anyway, we ended up getting divorced around 2006. And at that point, we had teenage boys, 2 boys. So I really got more serious about trying to understand, how are the kids going to be healthier than their parents were. And I was trying to understand attachment disorders and shame and some things like that. Been listening to some audiobooks and different things. From one in particular was The Universe in a Single Atom by the Dalai Lama while I was just at work. And just walking along one day, all of a sudden, in one phase cycle or whatever, it felt different to be me. So it was outside my belief system, which was pretty agnostic, has been agnostic forever, because logically you never know what's outside the box, and so you can't prove anything, basically. You come up with a good approximation. I mean, if you're a research engineer, you design experiments, you test them over a range of operating conditions, and you know what happens in that range of operating conditions at that point in time, but you really don't know what's outside the range of experience you've experienced. And so, yeah, that really freaked me out because it was outside my belief system, and just all of a sudden it felt totally different to be conscious as me than what it had felt before.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that you really, from a research perspective, transitioning into this other consciousness of yours. I mean, thinking about it, mechanical engineering is really a very binary science with specific inputs and outputs. Well, how did you actually make the connection to the science of consciousness and human emotion, which sort of seems to have a very random inputs and outputs that seemed like a complete diversion from what your background was?
A lot of the work I did while I was a research engineer was actually to do with coal slurries, which is really very chaotic, actually. When you get into the workings of, you think of mechanistic things as being deterministic and all that, but in the real world, doing real world problems, it's not. That's the simplification. And a lot of times, as an engineer, we linearize things and simplify them so that we can come up with answers that work for us today. But in my case, actually, the slurry is not that bad of an analogy to what the mind does, because there's this suspending fluid that's like basic awareness, and then inside that, or contained in that, and there's different sized particles that suspend each other and have different densities, and there's a buoyancy that anything larger sees. Anyway, somehow our mind builds objects that we work with, the words we're speaking, the images we process, all flow into what we experience as conscious experience. And so there's turbulence and chaos, and it's not predictable, and who knows where the answers lie, but you can still, through certain methods, characterize things, find patterns, and that's one thing our minds evolved to do, is to find patterns, to generalize is one aspect of mind that I find that's one basic aspect of our mind, is to be able to generalize and find patterns in the chaos. Mm-hmm. And part of my engineering training was in chaos theory. So yeah, when you get into nonlinear dynamics, things get really weird. and the brain's definitely a nonlinear system, just by its basic nature.
So the connections to random inputs and outputs in this chaos of the mind, what were some of the distinctions that you came up with or that you found to be helpful in your research?
One of the ways we analyze, one way of understanding what the brain is it's a controller, and that's what controls engineers do. They design controllers, they implement adaptive control systems is one thing, things that evolve based on their history and learning. Control systems connect with a mechanical body, say, or machine, and cause it to follow a certain path or perform in a manner that's been determined to be desirable. And it doesn't, most things in the real world aren't as predictable as that. There's a lot of noise in the system. And actually, sometimes noise makes the system more stable, which is really counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. So the control tries to take the noise out of the system, is the objective typically, because you want to have a controlled environment, right? We all want everything nice and smooth. Mm-hmm. Some systems, they actually inject white noise into the signal to get it to be more stable, which really blows me away that's how that would work, but it does. In the real world, the results show that sometimes noise actually makes the system more stable. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so in consciousness, the world's just coming at us. The brain's basically, I would call it a universal adaptive controller. It's basically evolved to the point where you can put down, the human brain's been evolved so that it can adapt to any environment that it is born into and figure out how to survive in that environment. And a lot of that environment is social environment. So a big part of the brain is devoted to social consciousness. And it's an inherently, it's evolved to work in a chaotic environment because that's the nature of the world we live in. It's very similar to signal processing in electrical engineering. How do you decode a nice clean signal out of just the white noise that has a little bit of signal? How can we get a clean signal off a satellite. That's such a weak, faint signal. And obviously we've been evolving our signal processing technology to make that possible. I mean, we had to do that to be able to do satellite TV and wonders of the modern age.
So given that you've got a pretty clear in your mind how processes and systems work from a technical perspective, what in your research has revealed ways that technology can be used to enhance mental health?
As a control engineer, I look at feedback loops. And, I mean, some things are feed forward. Genetics is feed forward for the most part, except they're learning more. It's a lot of feedback in genetic code, too. But from generation to generation, it's a feed forward system. Feedback, it gives us, if I'm doing well, then I want feedback from the people around me, right? That's how I learn and adapt. In the machine world, or more mechanistic point of view, things that we can do to become more aware of what's going on in our own head is a way that this fits in with technology. A lot of people have been playing around with different sensor it fits in with like EEG headsets is one way to use feedback to like augmented meditation practice where you're trying to control what's going on in your own brain as measured by brainwave patterns. And there's something called neurofeedback that you can actually use brainwave patterns to generate signals that actually change the neural structures in the brain and end up the objective being to create a more stable operating environment in the brain, because a lot of people end up being ruled by emotions that they can't control very well or are completely oblivious to emotions. And so one area to do that is with EEG headsets. Actually, there's a parameter that I really like that's measurable called relative. There's heart rate variability, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, is very useful for understanding how the autonomic nervous system is functioning, which mostly it controls our consciousness to a great degree, but we're mostly oblivious to its functioning. And there's two main branches to that system, which is sympathetic and parasympathetic, and it's really an important system for us to know as humans why we're doing what we do. And so you've really got to get into knowing what's going on with that activation, whether your normal short description of that is the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight type responses, and the normal description of the parasympathetic is it's the feed and breed circuit in our body and brain. But it's more complex than that, because there's something that I want to get into more later on attachment that's tied in with that parasympathetic axis, and probably both sides actually, but it's underappreciated from what I can tell in normal psychology.
How do you envision the future of conscious robots and Qualia as a natural language?
As a robotics trained as a robotics specialist, I think of somehow the brain creates my reality. And that reality, it's not just red. All of my conscious experience is really something that my body, somehow my brain is producing this experience. It produces all the colors. It produces presents me with a visual world, presents me with an inner sense of my body. I feel pain when pleasure, I feel happy, sad, I feel all of these different things. I learn language and I say things, I hear things, and all of that, I say, is Qualia. I mean, all of my reality, all I ever really know is Qualia. It's something that's evolved somehow to communicate between the body and the mind. It's a language that it's like the most fundamental natural language that exists as far as I'm concerned, because that's how my reality is constructed. And assuming if I'm not totally Eastern down that rabbit hole, and I believe I really do have a body and there is a physical world, it's not just all my imagination, then there's got to be some causal pathway between consciousness, and if there's some semblance of free will, there's got to be causal pathways from consciousness to move my body. And there's got to be causal pathways from sensors in my body into my consciousness. But nobody's got a good explanation for how that works yet that I'm aware of.
Interesting. Let's dive into some other topics which our listeners would be interested to hear your perspectives about. Let's begin with the attachment theory. Give our listeners some background on this theory and why it has your attention.
Well, that's part of what I was exploring when I triggered the reaction I had in 2008, and that is there's something in the DSM codes called borderline personality disorder, and it's better characterized probably to me as attachment, an insecure attachment style, and then maybe some in that particular diagnosis, there's almost always a post-traumatic stress type component to it as well. But attachment was a concept developed by John Bowlby. They were looking at children removed from families and hospitalized during World War II in England, and noticed, kids need to be held. Babies need to be held. There's just, from an evolutionary point of view, the strongest and most intense need that humans have, mammals at least in general have, is the need to be held when they're born. Mm-hmm. And then that's how they feel safe in the world. The world's a terrifying place if you're all alone and conscious in it. So the body's got this system, and it's built into the autonomic nervous system from what I can see. Mm-hmm. And it's basically, so if as a controls engineer and research engineer trying to characterize a system, sometimes you try and generalize, okay, what's the first order approximation, second order approximation to a data fit on the data set you've got. And to me, the first order approximation to all human behavior is this attachment system, because it's the drive that keeps us from being eaten by the predator. So it's life and death. So if it fails, there's no reproduction. No. Everybody who's alive today succeeded. Their ancestors all succeeded at not being eaten before reproduction is a given. And it's fractions of a second mean life and death in this system. Mm-hmm. So it's really urgent and it's intense. It's the most urgent and most intense experience is driven by this attachment system, the way I look at it as an engineer. And then it's more intense than taking the next breath. That's the next most intense thing probably is breathing. Respiration's pretty urgent too. And then somewhere down the list, all of Freudian psychology was pretty much built on sexuality, but sexuality is irrelevant except for a short. At some point you got to go there, but it's really not the main, most urgent drive by any means. Nutrition comes before that. So to meet your basic needs and survive to reproduction, you've got to not be eaten, you've got to breathe, you've got to eat, you've got to grow. And my argument is that the most intense one, this attachment system, really is it defines human development all the way through to the end. Mm-hmm. Through death. Ultimately, fear of death is about attachment too. And maybe these word experiences that people have, like I had, are about that same attachment system realigning to a collective rather than individual ego structure. But the way I'm looking at it, as a toddler starts to explore the world, it's necessary for them to have some freedom to go explore. Then they come, something bad happens, they have to run back to their primary caretaker and reattach, be held physically, and feel safe again. And then after they feel safe again, then they can go explore some more. In early childhood, through the first 3 years of life is where that development's really important and defines the character through a person's whole life for the most part. And the part where I diverge from normal psychology on thinking about this is I think that what they would call abnormal is actually a normal adaptation to growing up in an unsafe environment, because people who get mixed signals on feeling safe by going back to their primary caretaker develop what's called an insecure attachment style, and there's another one called avoidant attachment style. But in any case, they can't run back to mom or dad and feel safe again on a reliable basis. And I have a feral cat population I use for guinea pigs, sort of observe them, and I see the same patterns in the cat population that I see in the human population that way. It's the same system working as how secure they feel around me versus if they've grown up in an unsafe environment, they're just naturally skittish, and that's a normal adaptation for survival in the environment they grew up in. So I'm saying this is genetically determined for survival. Doesn't mean it's the happiest life. It just means it's the most likely to survive life.
Well, let's move on, and why don't you give our listeners your perspectives on drives and inhibitors, or let's say affects versus emotions.
I mean, yeah, if we get into system dynamics, you've got to have something that energizes the system. And for it to be stable, you've got to have some brakes on the system too. So in understanding ourselves, I've talked some about that drive system with regard to affect to the attachment systems. And besides that, then there's other, I guess you call it taxonomies, different ways different people have tried to break down that. And I've been through two different ones that I like a lot, just reading, trying to understand it all. And one is affect theory, which is an idea presented by Sylvan Tompkins back in the 1950s, 60s time period. And a lot of that was based on observing his own child growing up. And his theory says a lot about how, as conscious beings, our body has to teach us what emotions are. I mean, we have the response and the electrochemical reactions in the brain and the body, and then we experience those as conscious beings, whatever this Qualia interface is. And then that's how we learn what that is, to be happy or sad or angry, whatever is actually our body teaches us that, according to affect theory. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to get into that deeper. He has a whole breakdown of different drive systems, the way he has it defined. Another one I've read is in a book called Archaeology of Mind by Jack Panksepp and Lucy Bivens. Has a different taxonomy, and it focuses a lot on seeking as one of the drives that they talk about, and that's something that's available for deeper exploration. I learned a lot about neurochemistry getting into that. They've based their work mostly on work with localized injection of different chemicals into the brains of live rats and observing responses, and done other animals besides rats, but a lot of that's based on rats, and trying to understand what's the drive and inhibition system, and they have a pretty good logical explanation that's slightly different than the affect theory one. But when you get into control theory, one of the factors that you look at is how energy is conserved in the system, and there has to be something that makes the system move, and then there has to be, if it's something that's done in the plus domain, and some systems naturally come to rest over time, and some systems naturally blow up over time, and as conscious beings, we have to actually walk that line. That's a very fine line of what's too much, what's too little, what gets you out of bed in the morning, or what makes you depressed and you don't get out of bed in the morning. It's a very fine line in the system dynamics. And so it's something that we need to understand better and be able to, if we ever figure out how Qualia work, I think it might be easier for us to take better control of that system. But first we've got to have a good working model, and I think a lot of what I hope for is people can just for themselves learn their own bodies and how to work out the right balance for them, because it's all about balance, finding the right balance, what works for you to have the life that you want to live.
Well, that sounds a little bit like a good transition into, Jeff, why don't you talk a little bit about topology and consciousness, sort of like changing the subjective experience of being human.
Topology is a specific branch of mathematics, and I am assuming that if I can suddenly, just in one instant, change from feeling one way to feeling another way, that the brain can support multiple topologies as far as how it's created, how consciousness works, fits into the brain. I don't claim to understand it, but in mechanical engineering, one method of analysis has to do with coming up with vibration modes. A single structure can have different stable vibration modes. And in nonlinear systems, there can be weird transitions between them. So I really look at the brain as having the potential for, at the very least, three primary modalities. One that we normally associate with a split sense of self and other, versus what comes into non-duality, which is what some people would label the experience that I had is a shift from dual into non-dual, the collapse of the subjective into the objective, which is meaningless unless you experience it. But it's the basis for religious experiences in general and spiritual experiences. And from what a lot of people say, it's a normal stage in individuation and development. A lot of people get there at some point in their life if they are susceptible to that. And so there's two different, it has to do with our ability to see ourselves. And somehow consciousness has to divide into two parts to be able to see ourselves as others see us. And that's where it's a socializing domain that we need to properly socialize. We need to feel guilt, shame, worry about what other people think about us. If we don't ever have that split, we might just be psychopaths. Right? It's something that, from what I can tell, probably starts in around 3 or 4 years old, somewhere, whenever we start to become aware of our mortality, and that's tied in with this. But being able, it's intimately tied in with the shame and the parasympathetic axis of the autonomic system. I think it's an inhibitory system, causes us to have this split where we worry about what other people think about us, and to varying degrees, and that helps us socialize and fit in with this society that we've been born into. Part of the universal adaptive controller idea, basically our brain is highly adaptive, and it's so adaptive it's unstable, actually, is the way I look at it, because it needs that template that society provides us. Otherwise it might just go off into its own weird. Anyway, there's obviously psychopath negative consequences to not being connected socially. Mm-hmm. And so we need that socialization and the experience of the previous generations accumulated up to now to give us the right template. And this split and feeling shame and guilt, fear, it drives us that way. And if we have a non-dual experience of that conditioning, qualia, whatever, the thing that feels really, really bad that you avoid at all costs sort of goes away, which it makes it feel really good. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a desirable experience, but it has some negative consequences as well. There's always some bad with the good. So it's a less stable system. You don't have that social context that's grounding you as well anymore. Mm-hmm. And aside from that, in the subjective-objective mode, in that split, it seems like there's two different sides of that you can take. Gives you 3 topologies, and I don't know how deep I want to get into that, but some people, if you grow up in that insecure attachment, it's almost like you're treated as an object and end up self-identifying almost as an object, and you don't really have your own sense of self-worth, and that you get your sense of safety from whoever's the strong presence in your life. And so, or if you grow up in a very loving environment, have a strong sense of self-worth, then you're really quite happy just being yourself and doing your own thing and being autonomous on your own, and maybe supporting others who aren't so well. And it almost fits into the gender roles as well. The specialization in the species of male and female is tangled up in that too, and not in a black and white way, but a fairly complex way. And my experimentation with the Kundalini breathing techniques showed me that I could fairly easily flip between 2 different modalities of consciousness that felt entirely different from each other. And then I could find a center that felt like the best compromise between the two. And for myself, to prove the point, was I was really wanted to climb up a mountain peak around home that's kind of treacherous, and I was afraid of heights. Well, I finally figured out the reason I was so afraid of heights was because my brain was throwing these images at me of falling if I was up high, or if I looked at somebody else who was up there, it was projecting images of them falling. And it was pretty much a right brain survival. Good maternal instinct there for keeping the kids alive and yourself, but not so good if you really want to take some risks and go climbing. And by using that breathing technique and shifting more of a left dominant pattern, all that just shut down. And it was just, I was in this flow mode of, okay, this hand goes here, this hand goes here. I could look down, no terrifying images of falling like I normally experienced. And so I sort of thought the breathing techniques were hokey sounding, but for me, they worked quite well, actually.
So, Jeff, this breathing technique that you're talking about, where did you find that? And, for our listeners' benefit, where should they look for those sorts of teachings that were so successful in your life?
I came across that technique in a book called Whole Brain Thinking. It was from back in the 80s. I since went back and looked at it and met the guy who they were quoted in that book, and his name is David Shanahoff-Kaltze. He's affiliated with the University of California at San Diego and has done quite a bit of work on trying to bring the Kundalini yoga techniques into mainstream psychology. He has a book called Sacred Therapies to treat specific disorders, anxiety, anyway. And there's a reason in neuroscience why the techniques work. I don't think in that book he ever describes what I was basically just using a nostril breathing technique that, near as I can tell, causes cooling in the sinuses, causes a shift in the balance of blood flow to the hemispheres just through temperature dilation of blood vessels to shift the blood flow balance a little bit, which affects consciousness. Why? So there's a physiological explanation for why these things work.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, I think that will be very interesting for our listeners to go and take a deeper dive into finding out about those things. So let's move on. We have one of our listeners does have a question, and it's related to a topic we spoke of earlier. Mick is a 36-year-old software engineer from Melbourne and wants to know if in any of your study you've seen evidence that AI, or artificial intelligence, has advanced enough for machines to ever feel emotions, at least somewhat similar to us humans.
Yeah, I have my own strong opinions about that. Contrary to some mainstream talk in AI, I don't think that if you're talking about Turing machines, computers, I don't think there's any reason to expect that they would feel any kind of emotion. I think if we're going to have machines that could feel emotions, we will have to understand this Qualia interface, and they will be entities who are as conscious the same way we are conscious. However that works, that we don't fully understand yet. But it will be by design, not by accident, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think, well, it's just an emergent property. If you make the system complex enough, you'll just get it. Maybe, probably not, my guess. That doesn't mean that you couldn't. It'd be quite easy, actually, with current AI technology to mimic emotions. But that doesn't mean that the machine would feel. How are you going to make a machine feel pain? It could act as though it felt pain. You can have sensors and interpret things and get the behavioral response, but that doesn't mean it would feel pain. There's got to be a better understanding of how, from the materialist perspective, there's no such thing as consciousness and free will, kind of. It's just everything happens mechanistically, and you sort of go down the same rabbit hole with the idea that AI could actually feel things. There's got to be a reason why it happens, and it's not just going to be an accident, in my opinion.
All right, great, thanks. I'm sure that Mick will find that an interesting response. So as we wrap up, Jeff, what is on the near-term horizon for you with respect to research and or speaking engagements at conferences?
Yeah, I'm supposed to give a presentation at upcoming Science of Consciousness, which is in San Diego in June. It was going to be in Shanghai, but they had problems. So it's going to be in La Jolla, California this June, and I'm doing a presentation on Taoist philosophy and the quest for synthetic consciousness. A lot of it's related to what I've talked about here. But
great, good stuff. So how would our listeners be able to follow your work or where you're going to be? Do you have a website or anything like that people can go to?
I have a company website called under Paradigms of Creativity. Under Paradigm Research is a research company I've set up. Okay, so the website is? ParadigmsOfCreativity.com. ParadigmsOfCreativity.com. Great. And I have a disclaimer that's not very well maintained currently, but I should get better at that. I've got a few links off it.
Good.
I put up a YouTube video of a presentation I did at the Science and Non-Duality Conference last fall on a YouTube channel under Jeff Beck. That should be linked from my Paradigms of Creativity website.
Great. Well, all right. Well, thank you, Jeff. It's really been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for your time, and I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Great. Well, I'm John, and I look forward to you joining me again on another episode of the Emotions Matter podcast.